Hello and welcome to the Oxford Wine and Spirit podcast. My name's Tom Brady and I'll be your host today. Today is a very exciting episode for me. It's a subject that I'm extremely passionate about. And like a lot of my colleagues doing their WSET Diploma at the moment, it is the topic of my dissertation. The subject is regenerative farming, and my guest today is Tony Chapman. Tony is the director of wine growing at Donum Estate, who are based in Carneros. They've got vineyards all over Northern California. They're pretty well known, although they're not quite yet available in the UK. They will be very soon, I've been told. Anyway, that's enough from me. Let's get on with today's episode. Tony Chapman, welcome to the podcast. Before we launch into our discussion today on regenerative viticulture, I think a lot of our UK listeners might not be that familiar with Donum Estate or even places like Carneros and Russian River. I was hoping you could take a moment to introduce, first of all, yourself, but also the winery. And if you could give us a little bit of information about where in the world you're located and a general overview of the incredible wine coming out of California right now.
Thanks for having me. I am a native Californian, born and raised in Northern California in Marin County, just south of Sonoma County. Wine was always kind of a part of my upbringing. My parents would have wine at dinner most nights, and they were, fairly liberal with us in terms of letting us smell and taste the wines, and I kind of have that understanding, that connection to food and wine. And when it came time to study something, I just was really only interested in wine and viticulture. So got my degree from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo, in wine and viticulture, concentration in viticulture and enology, and then kind of just went off working for producers all over the world. I worked at Tablas Creek in Paso Robles, which has been a great advocate of regenerative viticulture. Bell Hill Vineyards in New Zealand, Bedrock Wine Company in California, worked at Mac Forbes down in Australia for a couple of years, Morich in Austria, came back to California in 2016, worked at Punchdown Cellars for a number of small producers, and then made my way over to the Donum Estate in 2019. And Donum, we're based in Sonoma County, in Carneros on the Sonoma side. So Carneros is the only California AV that spans two counties, Napa and Sonoma. So on our estate property, which I'm at right now, houses our winery and just over 90 acres of planted vines. The property itself is around 187 acres. We have another 30-acre vineyard about a mile and a half down the road called the Thomas Ferguson Vineyard, TFV for short. And even though it's only a mile and a half down the road, very different vineyard in terms of soil profile. We have a 16-acre estate vineyard in Russian River. That's going to be north of us. And that vineyard has very different soils than what we have here in Carneros. And so that really plays into the difference in farming and winemaking to some extent as well. The big influences in the Russian River are going to be the Petaluma Gap to the south, and then the Russian River to the west. Here in Carneros, our big influence is going to be the San Pablo Bay. We also have two other estate vineyards that we really didn't touch on much when I met you in London, but it's a great 20-acre vineyard on the true Sonoma coast between the town of Freestone and the town of Bodega. So as far as a bird flies, less than 4 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So that maritime air out there really leads to these long growing seasons, and out there we have kind of the very well-known and famous Gold Ridge soils. And then lastly, we have Savoy Vineyard up in the north end of Anderson Valley, so switching counties now up to Mendocino County. Very diverse soils up there. We have Franciscan shale, we have some sandstone, we have some clay loam, so very unique. And up there we do have the Pacific Plain and influence on that vineyard as well. We're right across from the Hendy Woods and the Navarro River. So that kind of gives, some geography kind of basis for everybody. But the other kind of interesting thing about Donum and, in contrast with the winemaking and the farming, the owners, Alan and May Warburg, have put together this world-class collection of art installations on the property. It's beautiful. So we really like to say at Donum that this is the intersection of fine wine, regenerative farming, and art that connects a global community.
Am I right in thinking you're specializing in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay?
Yeah, correct. So we're mainly Pinot Noir. We do grow some Chardonnay as well. We have less than an acre of Merlot. We just grafted over half an acre of Cab Franc, and then we have about half an acre of Pinot Meunier. But other than that, yes, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is primarily what we do. We have a lot of different clones and rootstocks, but in terms of the Pinot and really the Chardonnay side, we are really more focused on the California kind of heritage clones now.
And that plays up, of course, to the conversation we're going to have talking about soil. Pinot Noir being this grape that really responds to different soils and different climatic influences. And you talk about these wonderful plots you've got all over Northern California, and it must be fantastic to be able to take these blending options or even single vineyard options and work with them to create a portfolio.
Absolutely. I mean, I think single vineyard is, as far as Pinot producers and consumers, that's really where I think a lot of the interest is to see how different these expressions can be. Even though they can be so close together, sometimes, within the same vineyard itself, just different block, different aspect, different soil profile. Pinot is unique in that sense where I think it has this heightened ability to really showcase, where it's from. And there's never a lack of intrigue during harvest and fermentations with these micro fermentations and how different and complex they can all be.
So we've got to start with the basics for anyone who's unfamiliar with the topic. In the briefest possible way, would you be able to describe the practice of regenerative viticulture?
I think, a lot of people are going to have slightly different definitions when it comes to regenerative viticulture. For me, regenerative viticulture is really a holistic approach to soil health and grape growing. So it focuses on constantly improving soil health and just vineyard adaptability. And that includes, the greater ecosystem as well. You're looking at the vineyard within the ecosystem as a whole, which I think is very, very unique and different than a lot of other growing practices. So, the idea is that you're striving to achieve this ecological balance while also being a practical farmer and growing high quality grapes. And I'm really using empirical evidence to support the changes in the farming system, endlessly trialing new practices to help drive soil and vine health further. Some of these practices, which are less up for debate, include integrating livestock into the farming system. We're trying to encourage biodiversity wherever possible, minimizing tillage, keep the soil covered, keep living root in the ground, and just promote the diverse and active soil microbiome.
This no-till movement is something that I think is gaining a lot of traction, particularly in conversations surrounding regenerative viticulture. Could you expand on this subject a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I agree. It is definitely been a topic of conversation alongside regenerative viticulture. So, and it's a nuanced topic at that. I think, when you till or cultivate the soil, you're breaking up that natural soil structure. You're destroying those soil aggregates, which is going to affect soil aeration and water infiltration. You're really going to be exposing the soil to wind and water erosion by removing that protective layer of soil and vegetation, that friable soil layer. And then you kill a lot of the microorganisms in the soil when you do cultivate. This, leads to those microorganisms releasing all their nutrients. So in the short term, you see this big flush of fertility, which is one of the main reasons farmers till. However, when you repeatedly and relentlessly till the soil, you end up really creating this hard pan underneath that friable soil, which you're tilling. You're throwing your fungal to bacterial ratios way out of whack. And that's really because you're kind of rapidly aerating the soil. Bacteria is going to respond better to that, come back stronger. But your beneficial fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, the trichoderma fungi, like that is going to be the populations that you're really negatively affecting, which is going to lead to, having the soil having this weakened kind of natural disease suppression, less just natural nutrient and mineral cycling in the soils. That being said, there's obviously some benefits to tilling, which is why, we see that in vineyard management. You're breaking up surface compaction, you're prepping a really nice seed bed to seed your cover crop into. In the spring, if you till, you're going to warm up your soils, which is going to decrease, the frost. Basically, you're going to decrease that chance of getting frost in your vineyards, having that heat radiate off the soils. However, I think, with the regenerative perspective and through that regenerative lens, you're essentially doing more damage than benefit you're getting out. And so where you can minimize the soil, keep that soil structure and those aggregates in contact, keep those fungal, communities thriving, that's really what we're aiming for. So, a lot of growers take, regenerative growers kind of take this multi-pronged approach. We have some blocks that we farm 100% no-till, and we don't see really a difference in vigor. We don't see a difference in yield. And that's great. And then we have other blocks where, we feel that we do need to till based on the soil composition, what we're seeing with the cation exchange capacities. But even if we have to till those soils, we're taking an approach, really reducing the amount of passes, try to only get away with one pass. And then that pass that we do on that certain row won't get tilled for, another 3 or 4 or 5 years even. And then one of the big differences I think that we've made in the short term is we've moved away from the disc. And so our soils they have historically used the plow disc, and it creates a lot of smearing on our clay soils here in Carneros. We switched to a spader, which tends, I think, to be a lot more gentle on the soil. We see less kind of smearing. So in addition to kind of reducing the tillage, you're also kind of looking for what complements the soil the best and kind of does the least amount of destruction.
Going back to what you were saying about the fungi in the soil, this is something that I think is really fascinating. And I was wondering if you could draw a link for me between these, the sort of microbiome, the fungi based in the soil, and how that leads into vine health and grape growing.
It's a complex kind of subject to get into, but of course, I think a lot of people that are interested in wine in general have heard about mycorrhizal fungi, which have this incredible symbiotic relationship with a lot of plants, grapevines being one of them, which basically the vines are supplying these fungi with carbohydrates, sugars to keep them healthy, and then these fungi are kind of mining and supplying and converting, nutrients that the vines rely on, and they're converting them into plant available forms for the vines to take up. This is especially important in, immobile kind of nutrients in the soil, phosphorus being one of them, where, the vines are really relying on fungi. 80% of their phosphorus uptake is being supplied by fungi. So, they're incredibly important. And then you move on to different types of fungi like trichoderma, which I mentioned. These fungi do a really good job of kind of feeding on and outcompeting pathogenic fungi, which can have, a detrimental effect on soil health, ultimately vine health. So creating, a soil biome that's healthy and balanced, is imperative, I think, to growing not just healthy grapevines and grapes, but to increasing your soil organic matter and creating just an ecosystem within the soil that is going to be active and healthy for generations.
Brilliant. This is my geekiness coming out too much, so hopefully we haven't lost too many of the people at home. But let's move on. And I think it's really important to kind of discuss different methods of farming and kind of go back and look and say, right, so we have regenerative viticulture. How is this different to, say, something like organic farming or biodynamic farming?
Yeah, great question. And, this is definitely an answer that, depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers. But I think, organics is essentially just abiding by a list of approved organic materials, inputs, products that you can use, and abstaining from a list of inorganic products and inputs that you can't use. It doesn't have anything to do with, tillage and really looking at the vineyard as this ecosystem. It doesn't say anything about that. And then in terms of biodynamics, I think it's a lot more closely related to regenerative, although regenerative doesn't, I don't think, have the dogma and the spiritual considerations that biodynamic does. Regenerative, really puts an emphasis on focusing, on the most recent kind of scientific studies and findings, and taking those into account and incorporating those into our practices. Whereas, biodynamics is really just taking the teachings from Rudolf Steiner and incorporating that into the farming system. The holistic side, I think they're very, much aligned in terms of that. But I think, in a lot of ways, regenerative viticulture, it really forces you to get to know your soils incredibly well. So you have to learn the soils in a really intimate way. And that is not only going to, influence decisions such as tillage, like we just talked about, but it's going to influence a lot of other decisions in terms of, cover cropping and irrigation and floor management and, all these other things. And so I think, with organics and biodynamics, there's a lot of great practices. There's some overlap with regenerative 100%, but regenerative, kind of as we talked about in the first question, it looks at it just through a slightly kind of different lens and a perspective where this is all connected into this greater ecosystem rather than just farming, a vineyard.
I know one of the most controversial topics when we talk about organic farming is this idea of putting copper and sulfur in the soil and the potential negative effects that these things can have down the line. When it comes to regenerative viticulture, is there anything that you are putting into the soil, or is it really just all about the cover crops?
In terms of soil inputs, there's certain things that we put into the soils here, whether it be compost, biochar, there's organic soil inputs you can put in pre and post planting to help balance the soils, gypsum, dolomite, things like that. Where they're going to be regenerative, you can do that in the regenerative system. The idea, of course, is that eventually you get the vineyards to a place where really your cover crops and the ecosystem that you have created within this agricultural setting is we don't need to put these inputs in place. The nutrient cycling, the soil food web that we've created through our farming practices are supplying the vines with, everything that they need, macro and micronutrients. Now, like there's no kind of rule with regenerative viticulture where it's like you can't add, compost. Like, of course, you can continually add compost if you want. Again, like the idea is that you're eventually going to get to the space where those inputs are going to be less, important for vine health, and it's going to be more about the soil directly supplying the vines with what they need, having these, kind of long breakdown cycles of minerals and nutrients to supply the vines, and not just, needing these short bursts of fertility. That's, really the goal. And I always like to kind of say, there's no kind of destination to regenerative. We're constantly looking in ways to improve the farming system, and that's, I think, part of the challenge, but it's also kind of part of the fun and fulfillment as well.
That's a really good way of putting it. I'm sort of trying to think of an analogy for it, and all I've got at the moment is something like, if you're looking at organic, maybe it's like teaching your child to ride with the stabilizers on, whereas when it comes to regenerative, you're actually teaching them to ride the bike, and eventually they're going to get to the point where they can just do it by themselves. And
that's a great analogy.
And that's it.
It's a great analogy. I love it. I mean, I think, even with like sustainability, it takes this approach of and static. And viticulture in general, it's not static. Things are always changing, things are always evolving. And so, I think, we're really trying to make sure that the soil has more being, put into it in terms of that neutral cycling than we're taking out of it through harvest every year.
You mentioned biochar. I just want to step back and see if you could tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on biochar. But I said, briefly, essentially, it's a very stable form of carbon. Wood burns twice. It burns, from wood to charcoal and then charcoal to ash. And we're really trying to material that we're interested in that charcoal material, and it has this incredible crystalline structure. It's very porous, but it basically provides this incredible habitat for microorganisms to live and thrive in. It retains phosphorus, I think, better than any other organic material. So it's really unique in terms of its kind of water holding capacity, its ability to foster, microorganisms, populations. So we make our own on our estate. We incorporate it into the compost. We activate it. We spread it. And the great thing about biochar is, if you keep your soils biologically active, it's going to remain in the soil for a long, long time. I mean, way outlive us, which is pretty cool. And then I know we're going to talk about this, I'm sure, later on, but just in terms of how these practices are affecting eventually wine quality. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but there's a great study actually that shows it's like, you have your control, you have compost and biochar, and you have biochar. And then they actually fermented these wines kind of separately and did separate juice panels. And the biochar plot, it had like an outrageous amount of biochar per acre, but it actually had the highest anthocyanid content. And so I think that's really interesting to think about, biochar affecting not just soil health and great quality, but how it actually is having an effect on wine quality as well.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
I knew that study. I think you'd like to read that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Maybe we can put it in the show notes as well afterwards, so anyone listening can check it out. Can you tell me a little bit about the utilization of animals in the vineyard?
Here at Donum, a lot of regenerative farm vineyards, they're using a lot of different type of livestock, ruminant animals to graze. Here at Donum, we're using sheep primarily as our grazers. We've partnered with an incredible contract grazer, Chaos Sheep outfit. Robert Irwin's the owner. I think he's basically been sheep farming for his whole life. Incredibly knowledgeable. He talks about sheep gut biome the way that we talk about wine fermentations. I mean, he is incredibly knowledgeable and very passionate about farming the best sheep possible. So we have them come in and we try to get them to do 2 passes, although some years that's very challenging. But we get them at least to do 1 pass on everything. And they're adding their urea and their manure to the vineyard. They're cutting down the cover crop and under vine. So we're keeping tractors out longer, which means we're reducing our compaction. We're reducing our diesel usage, our carbon emissions. So many benefits. And one of the interesting things is there's, again, a recent study that just came out where they did a field where they mechanically mowed it. And they did a field where they mechanically mowed and then sprayed sheep saliva over that. And that block where they sprayed sheep saliva over grew back 80% faster than just the mechanically mowed. So it's incredibly interesting to see not just the fertility that the animals are adding, but the enzymes that they're adding as well. Here at Donum, we also have a little mobile bird coop that we have chickens and ducks in. We move that around block to block during the growing season. During the winter, it's actually quite heavy, so we're unable to kind of move it around in the winter. It just kind of sits in one spot. But during the growing season, when the soils dry out, we're able to pull that around and move that block to block and have the ducks and chickens kind of go into the vineyard, help kind of cut down on some pest pressures. The ducks are incredible at they target, snails and things like that, more of the hard body pests that we have in the vineyard. And then the chickens are, if they find a vine with mealybug, you'll kind of see them just kind of pecking around it, scratching at the bottom of the surface of the soil. And, they're adding, their, manure as well. And I think just that diversity of enzymes in the chickens and the ducks and sheep manure adds a lot of benefits to the farming system as well.
Do you ever have an issue with the animals eating the grapes?
It's a good question. So we don't have them in during the growing season. So the sheep are only here during dormancy. Right when we start seeing bud swell, we're typically trying to get them out of the vineyard. If you leave them in there for a long time, like once they've kind of eaten down the cover crop, they will start kind of munching on the swelling buds, but we're pretty diligent about moving them out. We're doing this intensive grazing, so they're only grazing a very small amount of acres with a lot of amount of sheep. So we're moving them literally every day. So we don't have a lot of issue with that. As far as the chickens are not super interested in the grapes on the canopy because they are in there during the growing season. The ducks sometimes will try to pop up and get some of the lower hanging fruit, but it's such a small amount. We're not too fussed about it.
Must be quite fun to see anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a great visual and aesthetic to have in the vineyard. The animals kind of incorporated into it. It's fun to see.
But let's move on. So for the longest time, it's felt like regenerative viticulture hasn't had a recognized certification body. Is that still the case?
No. So I think there's several certification bodies now for regenerative. Donum Estate is certified by the Regenerative Organic Alliance, the ROA. So their three kind of main pillars are soil health, social fairness, and animal welfare.
And in terms of community, back in 2023, I spoke to Marcus Garicho. He's a regenerative winemaker for Bodegas Al Conde, who are based in Navarra. Shout out to Marcus. He's making some really delicious wines over there in Spain. He mentioned to me that there was a network of winemakers growing grapes regeneratively, but the numbers on the ground were very scarce in terms of people that he could actually reach out to. Very few in Spain, for example. He said there were a few people he could speak to, but not so much of a community. Is this an experience that sort of corresponds to your own kind of education and community of winemakers? Are you in touch with a lot of other regenerative growers, either from the wine industry or just more widely across the farming industry?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am in contact with other regenerative growers all over the world, really, within the grape industry and outside the grape industry. I think that we're seeing this community grow a lot and expand. I think every time I go to a regenerative seminar, I'm seeing a lot of new faces, and it's always great to see people in the wine industry get excited about this type of farming. One of the things I think has really changed is just the amount of resources we have now compared, to 5, even 2 years ago. One of the best resources, I think, is actually based in the UK, the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. Even though they're based in the UK, they interact and connect growers from all over the world. And over the London Wine Fair, they launched the RV Guide. And this is really, one of the best resources that anybody interested in regenerative farming and viticulture can get into, or, anybody that is looking for who is farming this way close by to me. And you can go on the RV Guide and the map and find out where you are and see, who around you is farming this way. And I think establishing that community is incredibly important. Collaborating with your neighbors is really important because, even if you might have some difference in microclimates and soil, profiles, you're going to have a lot of overlap. You're going to have a lot of the same disease and pest pressures. And if you can work with your neighbors and put up a joint kind of hedgerow and talk about what you're seeing in the vineyard scouting wise. Oh, I'm seeing mildew in this pocket. Like, you should check this pocket and confirm that pressure's higher there. Sharing, fungal spore data and things like that. Whatever that collaboration can happen, I think is super beneficial for the industry as a whole. So I'm a big advocate, for that. And I think in California, we're pretty lucky. I like to say, we have no secrets here. If people are interested in learning about what we're doing, reach out. We love doing technical visits. So we'll host wineries here and show them, what we're working on. And we'd love that, to be reciprocated and for us to go there and see what they're working on and, see what kind of ideas and practices or trials we can kind of take back and incorporate. So there's so much benefit to that. And I think, as an industry, we can get better at it, but I think here in California, we're doing a pretty good job now of supporting each other in that way.
That's really fantastic to hear. So myself being from Oxford, I think most of the winemakers I end up speaking to tend to be from Northern Europe. And we know pretty much here, it's cold and wet, and we've got a whole sort of list of challenges that farmers have to face in this kind of climate. California's obviously so different. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the challenges facing regenerative viticulturists working over in California. And regenerative viticulture actually helps to find solutions to some of these challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think now more than ever, the kind of issues and challenges we're facing, we're seeing in other parts of the world as well, right? We're seeing, similar things that we're seeing in California, we're seeing in Australia, we're seeing in parts of Italy. I have a lot of friends in Tuscany, and talking to them during the growing season is always super interesting because we're facing a lot of the same, adversities. But, in California, we're facing water scarcity through, different years. Luckily, the last 2 years we've had sufficient rainfall, but prior to that, we were in, pretty extreme droughts, and there's still a lot of water issues going on in the state, even when we do have higher rainfall years. High heat stress, high heat events, extreme heat events. We see that on an annual basis now. Soil degradation, of course, pest pressures we've seen increase just really from our warming winters, not having that cold winters. We're seeing more generations of certain pests. So it's really affecting kind of how we in the past have worked on controlling these pests to what we're seeing now. We're facing later spring frost than ever. And, just a lot of other kind of impacts of climate change. And, largely, I think regenerative viticulture, through the practices and principles have helped us address a lot of these issues by just kind of enhancing the resiliency, the elasticity of the vineyards, of the soil, of the vines, by promoting that soil health, and just reducing the dependency of these external inputs. But I think more than anything is with farming this way, you're allowing the vine's kind of natural immune system to fight back against these biotic and abiotic stressors. We're still going to have, there's regenerative viticulture. It's not like you cover up vintage variation. That's still very much a part of the wines and of the growing season. But I think if you can kind of minimize the negative impacts that the vines are feeling in that moment, I think is really important. And largely, I think that we do see a lot of those symptoms be alleviated through our farming systems.
I don't know if it was you that was talking about this in London, but I think there was a story about vines suffering from trunk diseases. The historic thing is that there is no cure for things like Esca. Is it the case that you can kind of help the vines improve and get better and sort of improve the quality of their output through these methods?
I think I was touching on this, and the block I'm referring to is actually just behind me. It's a Wente, Chardonnay Wente clone planted on 3309C. And this block kind of it has everything, right? It has leaf roll virus, it has red blotch, and then we discovered that it has Esca, so it has all these things kind of working against it. And we were going to rip it out years ago, and we, converted it to regenerative at the same time we converted the rest of the acreage. And we saw really, more research needs to be done on this in general, but just kind of anecdotally speaking on what we've seen here is we saw the sugar loading get much more efficient before. This would be not only the last Chardonnay we picked, but it would essentially be the last pick of the year. It just took forever to get to, a ripeness that we were happy with. And we've seen that change year after year, which has been really interesting. We've seen the vigor kind of be restored. Before we would have just a lot of funky things going on in the canopy, really short inner nodes, really low mid-cane growth. And then, of course, at the apical end, the apical dominance, very, very high vigor. And through kind of our regenerative conversion, we've seen this block, really produce high quality fruit. And the reason that we've kept it in the ground and haven't decided to rip it out yet is because our reserve Chardonnay from Carneros, a lot of it comes from this block, compared to other blocks of Chardonnay that don't have leaf roll and red blotch and Esca. And it's our oldest Chardonnay planted on our estate vineyard. And so I think potentially there could be a correlation to farming this way, letting the vines, natural immunity kind of adapt to these stressors that they have, viruses included. I would love to, see more of the hard science on this and research go into this topic.
It's one of the beautiful things of something like regenerative viticulture, when it's clear that there's so much still to learn, and it's really exciting to kind of be at this stage and be part of it and see where things go in the future. One of the things I wanted to discuss as well was the issue of soil temperature. I mean, it's got to be so important in California, drought being more of an issue than ever. You were talking about in the difference in the actual temperature of the soil for vineyards which have planted cover crops versus monoculture sites with bare earth between the vines. Do you think you could expand on this a little bit further and give us an indication as to what differences you've noticed since switching to regenerative?
In 2020, we started a tillage trial. And so we basically did, a third of the block, kind of conventional every other row till. We did a third of the block, kind of minimal till. So out of every 6 row, there would be 2 rows that were tilled. And then the last third, we did complete 100% no-till. And it was interesting because we took a lot of our data during the growing season in terms of vigor, yield, of course, and leaf water potentials, all those things. And then we also picked these and fermented them separately, treated them the same in the winery, and then took our juice panels and then our finished wine chemistry as well. And the differences are, they're pretty interesting. So soil temperature for sure, we see cooler soil temperature. We take our soil probes and thermometers, and surface soil is drastically different. The soil temperature of a cultivated row in, a hot summer day here in Carneros, it can be 180, 185 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, in the rows that we have that no-till crimped cover over it, the surface soils would be anywhere, from 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So, dramatically different. We noticed that the leaf water potential was a lot less, so the vines were just less stressed during the day, which was also interesting. Vigor was pretty much the same across the board. We noticed right at the end of the growing season, the no-till had a little bit of less vigor. I actually think that is a benefit, that I think they're switching from that vegetative growth towards ripening a little earlier potentially. But, to me, the real intrigue came when we fermented these wines separately and saw the juice panels and then saw the finished wine chemistry. And the finished wine chemistry had the no-till pH being lower, had the no-till TA being higher. So, just really interesting, that acid retention that was on the no-till. And then sensory-wise, we actually just, as our winemaking team, just tasted this a couple weeks ago, and it was pretty much unanimous that the no-till was preferred. And we'll follow this trial until bottling, and as we always do, and see if that changes, of course. But we do these blind, to try to take out any bias, of course. But I think that is really interesting. Is this is now going to be our 4th year doing this trial, and to see if we're seeing this acid retention on an annual basis, that's something I think that we're going to need to consider as things warm up, and when we have more and more of these extreme kind of heat events. What can we do to protect ourselves against it? And I think this is one of the solutions to it.
It must be so huge for the structure of the final wines and what you're getting in the bottle.
I would love to do a bottling of this. I think our marketing team would hate me, but I think it would be so cool to do a bottling of this, no-till, minimal till, conventional till, and pour that in a lineup. I think it would be so fantastic, but it would probably be more appropriate for trade and people like you and me.
I'd be right there, but I'm not sure many of my friends would be, to be fair.
Yeah.
So let's move on a little bit and have a think. So if we've got any winemakers out there, any viticulturalists out there who are currently farming in a slightly more, I don't want to say industrial, but a slightly, I hate the word conventional as well when it comes to these things, but let's say conventional for whatever's sake. If you're looking to convert and move over to regenerative viticulture, what are the biggest challenges that that folks are going to face?
Yeah, I think if you're looking to move over, the first thing is change is hard, right? I mean, it's especially hard with farmers to make these changes, and it's hard with winemakers too. You meet these winemakers and you ask them about their fermentation protocols, and a lot of it is like what they learned their first vintage. They want to pump over the tank 10 minutes because that's what the winemaker they learned from did, and it worked for them, and it has worked well, and so they don't put a ton more thought into it. And so I think that change is tough. It's confronting. So that's always kind of conversion. Farming this way, you're going to need some new equipment. You're going to, whether that's a no-till seeder, whether that's a crimper, whether that's under vine device to remove your herbicide use, weed knives or under vine mowers or things like that. It's going to take some cost. I will say this, that when I first started at Donum, we made these investments, and then now we're seeing our farming costs kind of level out. And I think that's because when I first started here, we'd have very, very vegetative vines, a lot of growth. Things were out of balance for sure, and we had to pay multiple passes of leafing and lateral pulling and hedging, and now we have one hand leafing lateral pass, and it's well timed. And if we have to hedge, it's no more than once. And most blocks we don't even have to hedge. And so once the vines kind of reach this balance where they're sending the carbohydrates and energy towards the roots, towards the canopy, and then towards ripening in this kind of harmonious way, you end up reducing a lot of that handwork, rather than just putting in these synthetic fertilizers and creating these like incredibly robust canopies that are going to take a lot to manage. So the cost conversions for sure, there's the lack of knowledge, but like I said, I think there's so many resources now out there that is less of a factor. And then I think lastly, I would say just kind of establishing a research and development budget, I think is important. It's tough for a lot of producers to do, but if you could set aside a little bit of the budget to put in some of these trials, I think it's invaluable.
So we've discussed a little bit about biodiversity in the soil, in the vineyards, and the effects that can have. But what I find fascinating as well that you've discussed in the past is this idea of a greater biodiversity when it comes to the fermentation itself. I think the term you used was soil-borne organisms making their way into the fermentation tanks. And I was hoping you could go into this a little bit further and clarify how your fermentations have improved as a result of your farming practices, and what I know we've discussed this a little bit already, but what are the biggest impacts that this has had on the wines that you're making?
Again, this is something that I think as an industry would be great to have a lot more research on. This is something that, I want to here at Donum focus a lot more on as well. And, we're in the middle of thinking through, how to do that effectively. But yeah, essentially, we've taken a lot of scorpions from our early fermentations, and we're looking at what kind of microorganisms are in there other than Saccharomyces. And we're seeing, this incredibly diverse microbiome in the fermentations. And I think when you look at these non-sac yeasts that are in the fermentations, they're not super efficient at converting sugar to ethanol, if at all. But what are they doing? And I think a lot of winemakers would probably be scared, they're producing methyl acetate or they're producing BA. But, you look at these different microorganisms and you find out that, they produce organic acids, which is going to lead to a lot of esterification when those organic acids react to alcohol eventually. You look that they can produce glycerol, which is going to really affect kind of that mouthfeel and structure of the wine. So I think that a lot of these microorganisms really enhance the overall sensory profile of the wines. They also can kind of act as a biocontrol where they can kind of outcompete spoilage organisms in the fermentation. There's one microorganism, it's a soil microorganism, Cryptococcus. And there's just a study that was released that said that, this could be useful as a biocontrol in the vineyard for botrytis. And then you look into it and you think like, wow, how cool is that? This microorganisms could be a biocontrol for botrytis, which, we especially don't want in our Pinot Noir and Chardonnay grapes. But then, if it makes its way into the fermenter, it can also, produce this glycerol production during lag phase before Saccharomyces takes over. I think it's super exciting. I think we put a lot of emphasis on our spray programs here because we want to have a really healthy and robust microbiome in the canopy. We want to have healthy sac populations so that we can have these other microorganisms in the fermentation and not worry about high VA and ethyl acetate and all these other problems that can happen. We want to have that lag phase where these other microorganisms are adding to the complexity of the wine. And then once Saccharomyces takes over, we can, have, of course, all the benefits of Saccharomyces, the ethanol production, the glycerol production, the flavor and aromatic production that they have. But before that, I think these microorganisms, not only just provide more complexity to the wines, but I think it showcases just more of our terroir that we have here, that the biotic elements of terroir. I think we focus, especially here in California, a lot on the abiotic elements, our annual rainfall and our growing degree days, and our wind here in Carneros is huge, has a huge effect on the wines. But, I think when you think about really purely terroir driven wines, you have to account for those biotic elements as well. That I think provides the wines with this energy, this vitality. I kind of describe it as like a pulse. You have a wine that just has like a pulse to it. That's not going to come from abiotic, factors. That's going to come from living organisms. So yeah, like I said, as an industry, it'd be great to get some more research on this, and we're looking into, ways that we can really do some analysis and look and try to find out more of what's in these early fermentations, other than just kind of what historically has been tested for.
I find it really interesting and almost a little bit strange as well when you look at the wine industry that people aren't talking about this a little bit more. I do a lot of work in the spirits industry, and particularly in the rum industry. It's a conversation that rum producers are having every single day about what the biological situation is like at different stages during fermentation, and how that structure is integral in flavor creation. It's not something that you hear a lot of winemakers talking about. So I think it would be really, really fantastic to hear more, really.
No, I agree. I mean, I didn't even know that about rum. That's really fascinating. That's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a conversation that we need to have more for sure. And I in a lot of ways, winemakers are so geared towards regenerative in the sense where they understand the importance of, microbiology, right, in their fermentations. So, how do we get winemakers to care as much about the microbes in their fermentations? We need to get winemakers to care about the microbes in their soil just as much as they care about what's in their fermentations, and see where that kind of crossover is. That's fascinating. And then I also think a lot of winemakers are, if it's anything but sac, they get worried and they get scared of the, potential spoilage properties or things like that. Again, I think it just really has to do with balance. We want to have high Saccharomyces populations, but having these other populations of microorganisms, like I mentioned, I think it not only adds a lot to the wines, but I think really showcases and demonstrates that purity of terroir, which, as far as Pinot is concerned, I think is one of the end goals.
And looking towards the future, is regenerative viticulture a practice that you think is just going to keep on expanding moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the awareness is growing. I think there's so much more education opportunities out there for growers. I think, really what would be incredible to see is consumer demand for regeneratively made wines. That, I think, is really the next step for regeneratively farmed producers. How can we educate these consumers to understand, how these practices are different, why we think they're, so special, and why we think, and believe not only do they make healthier soils and healthier vines and grapes, but like we just touched on, like why we think they make better wines. I think we're going to see, a lot of advancement in technology. I think that's going to really move things forward on the regenerative side. But But I think, getting our communities to understand the benefits to the ecosystem is going to be a big point too. How do we get our local communities to get behind, this style of farming, and realize all the benefits behind it. That's, I think, where it's going. That's where I think we're going to have some challenges, but ultimately, I do think the awareness is growing fairly rapidly, at least here in California.
Is there going to be a point where we can taste your wines in the UK?
Yes, there's going to be a point where you can taste Donum wines in the UK. More on that to come. You'll be one of the first to know, Tom, I promise.
I hope so. And if we want to find out a little bit more about Donum Estate, where's the best place for us to check out?
Our website, thedonunestate.com. Go on there. Also on our Instagram, Donum Estate. We post some farming stuff on there, as well as a lot of the art on the property and the wines. So yeah, website, Instagram are two great spots to find us and learn more.
Tony Chapman, thank you so much for your time and your insights. That was absolutely brilliant.
Tom, pleasure. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.